Okay. Hi, my name is Jordy Izzard, and I'm an Alumni Relations Officer at SAIS, and I'm here with Mort Dworken, who was at SAIS through the class of 1968, and today's date is October 15th, 2010, and again, thank you so much for being with us, and I hope to just kind of make this a conversation and ask you some questions that help us jog some of your memories of SAIS and let us know about your career. So I guess I'll just start with the first question being kind of what brought you to SAIS originally?
Well, let me go back a little bit. I know you've heard this before, but I can recall even in junior high school being very interested in international affairs.
Mm-hmm.
Something I think I got from my parents, who were part of what Gabriel Ullman, a political scientist I heard about at Yale, called the attentive public. They were very engaged in current events. They were attentive to it. I think that partly comes from both their educations, but also from the fact that during World War II,
Mm-hmm.
they were both here in Washington, both, I think by nature, outward-looking people.
And what were your parents doing in Washington?
Well, my dad was in the activated Naval Reserve during the first part of World War II,
Mm-hmm.
after Pearl Harbor, and was a gunnery instructor, naval gunnery instructor
Mm-hmm.
at Anacostia Naval Station, and later he was a gunnery officer on a converted cargo
Mm-hmm.
ship, escorting convoys in the Indian Ocean. He kept up that travel afterwards as a civilian. My mother was a driver for the U.S. Army,
Uh-huh.
and they both lived in Arlington. I was born during that time in 1944 at Columbia Hospital for Women, so I'm a D.C. Native, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
They wanted to stay in Washington. They wanted to be part of that exciting, immediate post-war time. But my father's father, a lawyer in Cleveland, Ohio, called my dad back home, and because he said he needed help in the law practice. And I know they were both disappointed by that, but I also know they kept their interest in current events. We saw a lot and did a lot as a family that seemed to be related to current affairs, both domestic and international.
Mm-hmm.
And they've traveled a great deal, both while I was growing up
Yeah.
and after I was entered into the Foreign Service and posted overseas. They visited me at every post,
Mm-hmm.
Except Vietnam during the war.
And we'll hear about where you were throughout the course of your career in a little while. But yeah, sorry, go ahead.
So that interest, I can remember a couple of mentors as high school teachers
Uh-huh.
that sort of pointed me in the direction of foreign affairs and an interest in international events. One in particular was the librarian at the school, who was the faculty counselor for the Model United Nations representation that my high school
Uh-huh.
sent a team to every 2 years.
Uh-huh.
And I ended up leading our delegation and
Great.
becoming, for a period of time in the greater Cleveland area, Model UN. I can remember being the General Assembly president at one point.
That's
So that was great fun. I can't remember the countries we represented. But
Yeah, that's always fun to see that.
That, I think, probably lit a fire
Mm-hmm.
in me.
And it changes all the time, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That didn't stop me from when I went to university,
Mm-hmm.
majoring in, at least starting out as a major in chemistry. But I very quickly transferred to political science.
Mm-hmm.
I was struck by some things that sound very, very strange now. I was struck by the use of original source material in the study of history and its relationship to current events.
Mm-hmm.
High school had not done that for me, either on my own or with the guidance of other teachers. It was all survey books and secondary and third sources, and not original source material, not all of that you get exposed to, I guess, more in a university environment. And very quickly I grew away from the science-based, math-based education from high school and more into the humanities, mainly political science and international affairs, but also some history and a little bit of political philosophy. That was a time when the National Defense Education Act was sponsoring a tremendous number of advanced placement courses, many of which were in the science area.
Okay.
And the money and the quality money and the quality teachers were in that area.
Right.
Not in the humanities, and definitely not in history and international affairs. So in a sense, I had to wait until university to get
the interest spark again.
the interest spark with an academic focus.
Yeah, that's great.
So
That's great. And did you go straight from Yale to SAIS, or did you have experience in between?
Straight in the sense of 4 years at Yale.
Right.
I had one summer overseas with an organization called ISEC, which I think is still operating. It's Association Internationale des Étudiants en Sciences Économiques et Commerciales. It's an organization that is a worldwide swapping of internships and traineeships. You find one for a foreigner in the United States with an American firm, and then your organization trades it for a position overseas for you as a trainee or a stagiaire, as I was called when I went to southern France and worked for a French construction company for a summer.
Interesting.
Yeah. It was good. I didn't have junior year abroad or anything like that. The rest of the summers I was a camp counselor in Indiana.
That's great.
But in my senior year I took the Foreign Service exam and passed it.
Great. Congratulations.
So,
that was a
thank you.
weight lifted.
It was.
And then, so did you go into the Foreign Service for a time, or did you go straight to
they asked
SAIS?
me to, and I said I wanted to do something else. I wasn't sure what. At that time I had a couple of irons in the fire, which I'll mention in a moment, because it directly relates to my decision about SAIS. And when they heard what those possibilities were, they said, you shouldn't do that. We'd rather have you come into the Foreign Service and we'll train you. You don't need to get experience overseas or anything or any more academic experience. We'll take care of that. I ignored that. I had two other offers. I was accepted into the Peace Corps and assigned to Niger. That was one possibility. And the other possibility was graduate school. And I seriously wanted to see whether I wanted to continue, I guess, in a more academic bent. And I applied to several schools, Maxwell School, Columbia, Tufts, Fletcher School, and here. And I was on the waiting list in either one or two of those, but SAIS accepted me. And I looked at SAIS even more after the acceptance than I had before. And I had these, in effect now, I had three possibilities: to go into the Foreign Service, to go into the Peace Corps.
It's a lot of fires.
Yeah, I
I
was quite pleased that I had these options.
Yeah.
And to go to graduate school. I chose graduate school.
Yeah.
And I chose particularly SAIS because I liked the mix of some academic faculty and some faculty who were actual current practitioners of international affairs one way or another.
Uh-huh.
And we're either teaching part-time on the faculty or on a leave of absence and intended to go back into whatever their foreign activity was. And I especially liked the fact that it was in Washington.
Yeah.
Because I was attracted to Washington.
Oh, you were born here too.
Yeah, but I hadn't been, except for a tourist, I hadn't been back.
That's great. And what are your, yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, so I chose SAIS, said no to the Peace Corps. You always wonder whether
Or what life would have been like,
a different road. I know that my assignment in Niger would have been outside of the capital in a peanut cooperative. Would have been the kind of advisor, I guess. And I knew absolutely nothing about I knew a little bit about French-speaking West Africa.
Yeah.
So I was attracted to that. I had French as an undergraduate. I ended up taking some French here at
I was going to ask,
SAIS
yeah.
as well. And
Yeah.
I had studied under Bill Foltz. I'd studied French-speaking West Africa, several of the countries. But I chose not to go into the Foreign Service because they were willing to swear me in, which they don't do now, and then put me on leave without pay, so that I didn't have to make a decision.
Right.
About
One way or
coming
the
in.
other,
And they
right.
said that they would, in other words, I was an employee, but not being paid anything. And while they could break the contract of sorts, it would have been hard for them to do so. In fact, they had already, in effect, committed to me. And so I had committed to them. I said
Sure.
after the 2 years of SAIS, I would go in the Foreign Service. So that's how that came about.
That's interesting. Yeah. So then there you were at SAIS. And tell us a little bit about your memories of SAIS and yeah, professors or classes or historical experiences might have been going on at the time.
Well, the building we're in now, 1740, was almost brand new. I don't know when it was built, but it was done when I got here in '66.
In the mid-60s, yeah, so it was right before then, yeah.
And the rest of this block was not quite the same, needless to say. And my first place of abode was just about a block and a half away. I was behind where Brookings and Carnegie are now. And there's a little parking lot back there, and there's, I think, some sort of modern apartment building. But at that time, P Street between 17th and 18th was all row houses. And I was in one of the more cockroach-ridden townhouses about a block and a half from here.
Yeah.
And I moved around several different places between here and up on Columbia Road.
That's great.
On the way to Adams Morgan. So I lived in this area for several years, and when I first went into the Foreign Service and went into training, I was still living here, and Washington was the place I returned to several times. So I knew this area very well. I knew a lot about DuPont Circle and the streets around it.
That's great.
Probably
and I
more
heard
than any other particular part of Washington.
Exactly. And I heard that the Canadian embassy was right next door or right down the street at the time.
This was a piece of Embassy Row. There were more embassies and more doctors' offices than there are now.
Interesting.
Nowhere near as many restaurants either.
How about the trees?
Trees? Well, there were some.
Yeah.
They were big. But you could see more greenery, I guess. I don't see as much looking out the window as I can remember.
Yeah. And what about courses or professors or students? What was that like?
Well, it was a great 2 years. It met every one of my expectations. I mentioned earlier about the faculty, and I learned even more as I went along that even those full-time faculty were consulting and advising and being drawn on one way or another. And I was very much taken by the interaction of practitioners and more academically oriented teachers and seminar leaders and instructors. I focused most of my effort in the national security area. I still kept a kind of a fondness, if you will, for West Africa. But most of my attention was on East-West relations, Soviet Union, Warsaw Pact, NATO, the strategic balance, and all of that, overlaid with a lot of interest in Vietnam. It was the height of the Vietnam War. I'd come out of Yale, a creature of a professor by the name of H. Bradford Westerfield, I think was his name, who was very much in favor of American engagement in Southeast Asia and Indochina and in the Vietnam War. He transmitted that, and I was receptive to it.
Sure, that's interesting, yeah.
But I went through a transformation. I can remember in 1968 marching on the Pentagon with the great mass of people across Memorial Bridge and demonstrating against the war at the Pentagon. I was quite concerned that this surveillance, there was helicopter surveillance, and it was clear that there were movie cameras.
Sure.
This was pre-video days. In the open side doors of the helicopters, and they were filming everybody that was marching across Memorial Bridge, and I was certain, because I was always attributing more capability to the intelligence community than was the fact, although it's probably true today, it wasn't true then. I was certain that my profile picture was going to be somehow singled out and matched against the fact that they cleared me into the Foreign Service, and that I was going to lose my appointment to the Foreign Service because of that. But I went anyway.
And it didn't happen.
I don't think
exactly.
I don't think there was any problem with it.
Yeah.
But I can remember there were a lot of us that were quite paranoid about the whole thing.
Yeah. Well, and tell me, when you left SAIS, what did you do in your career, and where did it start, and did it go where you thought it would, or have you evolved it?
Well, I stayed in for 35 plus years.
With the State Department?
With the State Department. So it was not a career choice that I was unhappy with. I liked every one of my posts, and they were, in many respects, there were no two comparable ones. They each had their own features, and they were all on balance positive. And I progressed through the Foreign Service to the Senior Foreign Service, so I have no complaints on that score either. And in fact, I'm still doing some part-time work for the State Department, as I mentioned to you earlier. I told you what my concentration in subject matter was, and the teachers that I had that I remember the most about, Robert Tucker, Robert Osgood, Bill Lures, Dinnerstein, and George Lishka, and Francis Wilcox, who was dean at the time. There was a focus on national security affairs, on balanced power between the Soviet Union and its allies, and the United States and its allies. And that transferred, if you will, over time into a specialization of mine in the Foreign Service of political military affairs. I went into the Foreign Service and wanted to work on relations with the Warsaw Pact and all of that. That's why I got sent as my first assignment to Vietnam. And my second assignment to Laos, where absolutely nothing that I had studied as an undergraduate or as a graduate student was applied at all. I mean, there was some vague awareness that I had minimum professional fluency in French, which helped my entry into the Foreign Service, but wasn't too much French used in Vietnam, not in the parts I was in.
Right.
I was less interested, both at SAIS and afterwards in the Foreign Service, in economic affairs. I did the least work in that area in graduate school at SAIS. I focused more on the national security kinds of things. I really enjoyed, I think more than any other particular subject, Soviet internal politics. I can remember writing for a professor named Bill Lures, who was in fact a Foreign Service officer who was teaching part-time here.
Right.
And I studied things like the doctor's plot of Beria and Stalin and things like that. Wrote papers on Kremlinology and Sovietology kinds of studies. And that was a great deal of fun, and I took that interest into the Foreign Service, but never got assigned to the Soviet Union, never worked in that area. So
have you traveled there a lot?
no, that was behind the Iron Curtain.
Yeah.
Once I went into the Foreign Service, I couldn't travel there.
Oh no, but I mean,
And
since then, have you
since
gone to
then, no.
Russia
I
at
want
all?
to go back. My surname, my family name, is it's of Lithuanian origin. So I'm told. Anyway.
Dworken, yeah.
And Dworken.
Dworken.
It's the same, supposedly. Lithuanian Jewish origin, somewhere around Kaunas. But for the longest period of time, I couldn't even contemplate going there.
Right.
And now I haven't actually been back. I could go there now. But I do want to follow that through. And the family migrated in the 1890s. Excuse me, from Lithuania, and then through Ellis Island, eventually to Cleveland, Ohio. And that's where my immediate forebears on my father's side came from. The rest of the family is also from Eastern Europe, Austro-Hungarian Empire,
Oh wow.
for the most part.
Yeah.
And I haven't been able really to focus on any genealogy, so I can't go any further into it than what I just said. But I do want to get back to that at some point.
That's great.
When I stop working,
Yeah.
if I
when
still
and if.
enjoy foreign affairs.
Yeah.
And when I retired from the Foreign Service in 2003, I thought I would look for some part-time work that was related to international affairs.
Like consulting or
And
the like, yeah.
I thought about consulting, and I went and talked to various NGOs, well, more interest group kinds of things related to my previous work in the Foreign Service, where I thought I could offer some expertise. But I also heard about a job in Tampa, Florida, with the U.S. military.
Really? Huh.
And I ended up taking that job, a full-time job, as a contractor. We moved to Florida, and I worked for the Special Operations Command in their headquarters there, on counterterrorism operations and counterterrorism planning. The Special Operations units had been tasked with a global responsibility that they had not performed before, which was strategic planning for military counterterrorist operations in countries with whom we are not at war, as opposed to Afghanistan and Iraq, where very clearly special operations forces were involved, but those were combat zones.
Right.
It's all the other countries that you still read about in the news, and even more so today maybe than then. And the question is, what is a judicious application of military force? And I brought to bear, I got the job.
Congratulations.
And brought to bear an expertise that they were looking for. It's not so much that the State Department wanted me down there.
Right.
In fact, when the military had come to the State Department and said, we'd like to have more than just one Foreign Service officer down there because we've got all these global responsibilities now, the State Department said, we don't have the money, we don't have the positions, and we don't have the people. So, sorry about that. And the military's answer was, their first answer was, okay, we'll just go hire people. And they were looking for senior Foreign Service officers. And I, having specialized in political military affairs, I had an affinity for that kind of work. They detected that and they hired me. Subsequent to that, the military decided that it would be cheaper if they gave the State Department money and transferred positions. And at that point, the State Department still didn't have the personnel to fill those slots. It wasn't just Special Operations Command, it was just about every military headquarters that had foreign involvements. And over time, the State Department got around to seeking an expansion from Congress and receiving authorization for that. And then they found their way clear to assign additional officers down there, with the Pentagon still paying. So the contract job I was in as an advisor to Lieutenant General Del Daly, who, a three-star general, who actually retired a couple years ago and became the ambassador for counterterrorism in the State Department. Just retired from that job as well. He was the man I was the foreign affairs advisor to. So that was great fun, but I got tired of full-time work. And so now I'm back up here after after 3.5 years down in Florida doing that kind of work.
And let me ask you, what advice for current students, or how, first I guess, how do you see SAIS today, and has its role changed, and maybe what advice would you give to students who are currently here?
Well, it's grown in size. That's obvious. There's another building. There's all kinds of additional faculty positions and more students. There's probably more internationalization of SAIS than I recall. I mean, I knew there was the other school, if you will, in Italy.
Bologna,
but Bologna, I don't, if China was, if our activities in China were going on then, I don't recall them, and I know there are other engagements that SAIS has. They had some effect because there were students returning and students going out, mainly to Bologna. And there was a lot of cross-fertilization in that sense. But I have the sense now that there's much more. I still think that SAIS is uniquely positioned, even more so than those parts of AU and GW and Georgetown that are internationally oriented. SAIS is, I think, a much more judicious mix of the practitioner and the academic.
Interesting.
And I'm pleased to see that it's kept its salience in the Washington community of so many think tanks and so many NGOs and so many organized activities during the course of any particular week or month. There's a lot of outreach that goes on. I still attend a seminar or a meeting or a book launch or whatever from time to time because there is a great deal that SAIS has its name on. So I'm still quite pleased to be associated with it.
That's great.
And I don't think a student today, an entering student, can get the same kind of helpful mix. I mean, for me, it's a government and academic mix. But it could just easily have been international business and academic, or
something less.
Or something related to international NGO work or private voluntary organizations, or foreign governments. I have a sense, you tell me, there are more foreign students here than there were in my day. And all of that is to the good. I don't
Sure.
think the Maxwell School or Columbia or the Woodrow Wilson School or any of the other Ivy League schools or the three major, well, I left out Howard and George Mason, but I don't think they offer the same kind of thing in the same mix that the others do.
Great. And what about?
I'm a partisan, though.
No,
I'm sure somebody
absolutely.
from GW wouldn't agree with that.
Oh, that's all right. They might. But what advice would you have for current students today, given what you've learned maybe in the course of your career and your work at SAIS?
Well, I guess a certain openness to assignments that don't necessarily on their face. If you're going into the government or you're going into business or finance or any other activity related overseas, whether it's NGOs or whatever, they're going to be postings, assignments, and it may not be in places that you know anything about or know much about, or it may not be in places or dealing with subjects that one is initially attracted to.
Sure. Yeah.
I was conflicted, for example, about my first assignment to Vietnam. In fact, my entering class in the Foreign Service was the last class out of which people were assigned for the first position to somewhere else other than Vietnam. The next class after mine, in the latter part of the summer of 1968, the next entering class received letters of invitation to join the class. There was a big caveat that said, you must accept also that your first assignment will be to Vietnam as a civilian, as part of the pacification effort. And if you are unwilling to accept that first assignment, then we hereby withdraw our invitation for you to enter the Foreign Service. For us, for my entering class, if you were married, or you had prior military service anywhere in the world, then you didn't have to go to Vietnam.
Oh, wow.
And so the great bulk of my class was assigned to various and sundry places. There were 3 guys and 1 girl who were assigned to Vietnam. And they had great qualms about assigning
Oh, yeah.
the woman. And they put her in the consular section in Saigon, but the other the three guys, which I was one, we were assigned to the pacification effort in province and district, out in the countryside. I knew nothing about that, and I was still essentially opposed to Vietnam, to the effort by that time, which would be another whole videotape.
Right.
But I also knew that I wanted to experience it. I found that whenever I voiced my qualms or concerns or opposition to someone who had been there, and there were students by that time who'd fought, either with the military or as civilians, and who were back at SAIS finishing up or starting out their degree programs. And their first question was always, what do you know? The second question was, when were you there? And I didn't have any first-hand experience. So I felt at a disadvantage in the argument, but also more than a little curious about what it would be like. So I was, on balance, ready to go. I went. And it turned out that that assignment, and from there a direct transfer to Vientiane, Laos, where I
She ended up going,
was in the embassy that time. I was deeply involved in the military, political part of a war that was a side war, if you will, to the main fronts in Vietnam, and therefore wasn't run by generals and ambassadors together, but was run essentially by an ambassador and a small country team.
Right.
And done more, well, it was called the Secret War, but it wasn't so secret. But it was essentially run by the CIA rather than the Defense Department.
Right.
And so a combination of 4 years, and especially 2.5 years intimately involved in the validating of airstrikes and
Right.
supporting that military effort by the Lao and the Thai and the Americans who weren't there but were. That kind of nailed me into a political military specialty. I didn't realize it at the time.
Mm-hmm.
So that even when I went to the South Pacific, to the Eastern Mediterranean, Europe, or I was working in Washington, or even in London, my last assignment.
Yeah.
All of those jobs were essentially related to, except the more senior management positions, that were related to the political effects and issues connected with an alliance relationship
Right.
with American military forces either in or around the country I was accredited to.
Okay. Huh.
And so there was a continuity through all of these,
Absolutely.
even though
A weaving. Yeah.
Greece and Turkey and the UK,
Yeah.
all NATO allies,
Yep.
with significant American military presence. I was involved in base negotiations in Greece and Turkey, a lot in the Asia-Pacific region, Australia, New Zealand, Papua New Guinea, those were all similarly oriented,
Sure.
in large part toward U.S. military activities and U.S. national security interests. And I
Great.
worked on base negotiations in the Asia Pacific, in the Indian Ocean area related to Diego Garcia, a lot in the Middle East and the Eastern Mediterranean, and then London I mentioned as well, and several jobs here in the States, in the Political Military Bureau related to military and economic assistance, so-called security assistance. Work with the Undersecretary for International Security Affairs on arms control and disarmament matters.
Done
And
quite a bit.
export controls, again, another piece of the same kind.
Absolutely. Yeah. That's great.
Yeah.
Well, super. Well, really, that was the gist of what I wanted to kind of talk to you about today. And if you have anything more to add, please feel free. And if not, I really thank you for your time.
You're welcome.
Yeah.
It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening.
Oh, of course. Very interesting. Thanks.